From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Elon Musk continues to release internal files from Twitter from before he took over the company and going back to the 2020 presidential campaign. In the documents he's releasing is that Twitter shadow banned certain individuals whose views differed from progressive political orthodoxy. Plus, Kevin McCarthy struggles to get 218 votes to become the next Speaker of the House. Why is it proving so hard, and who's the alternative? Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot, and I'm here today with Kim Strassel. Just the two of us will be hashing over these subjects. Kim, let's start with the Twitter files. They have seemed to have been released in three batches through two journalists, Matt Taibbi and Barry Weiss. They first showed some collaboration with Biden campaign officials and others to suppress the New York Post story in 2020 about Hunter Biden's laptop and his foreign business dealings. Second now is this batch which shows shadow banning of certain individuals, suppressing their Twitter feeds and views. And third shows a debate inside Twitter to ban Donald Trump on Twitter after the January 6, 2021 riot at the U.S. Capitol. What's your takeaway so far from all of this? What is it telling us about not just Twitter, but about our political debate and culture?
I would just give a shout out to one of the batches was also released by Michael Schellenberger, who's another writer. So we've had four at this point. He has also dealt with decisions that were made after January 6 about how to censor Trump in particular. And I guess I have two broad takeaways on this. One is that the latest batches really show the degree to which in the lead up to January 6th and the days after, Twitter just decided to be a content moderator at whim and sort of divorced from rules. But prior to that, they at least made an effort to have a more rules-based system where occasionally senior executives would step in and call a tough case. But after the election, and then definitely after January 6th, that became different. This very powerful group of people just started making decisions on a whim, sometimes in the space of seconds. And it's very clear that they were making it up as they went along. And that was particularly the case with Trump after January 6th. They sort of said, well, we're just going to have new rules based on his account, and we're going to look at things beyond just individual offenses, but put it all in the context of 4 years of bad behavior. They started looking at why tweets were put up in terms of their intent or their orientation. What were they supporting? Or the reception? Were they causing confusion? So it became very ad hoc. That would be the first thing. The second big thing, which we can talk about, is the degree to which we now know government was playing a role here, in that we have multiple examples and evidence that by the end, Twitter was having weekly meetings with the FBI, and at one point, the director of national intelligence. There was a lot of coordination. It seems as though the FBI was calling shots, telling them what to get rid of, and Twitter complying. And that's just really important, Paul, because it moves us away from this question of Twitter as a private entity and its power, therefore, to moderate its speech, to the question of whether or not it wasn't acting in concert with government, which is a very different question.
Yeah, on that point, I think that's what brings into this First Amendment implications. As you suggested, Twitter's a private actor, so it can censor what it wants, and indeed it has liability protection under federal law, so-called Section 230, to be able to make those distinctions. But where this comes into question is if it ceases being a private actor, or if it's still a private actor but acting essentially under the order, implied or direct, of government. And this is obviously a gray area since we don't know exactly all of the details. But there's no question that it raises serious First Amendment implications, as Democrat Ro Khanna of California had warned Twitter in real time in 2020 when they were banning the Hunter Biden laptop story. Now, it's a legal question, obviously, at one level. Is it, in fact, a First Amendment violation? And I think we'd have to know more, in my view, because we have to know all the documents. We'd have to, I think, have all of them released. And this is one of the problems I have with the way Musk is doing this, releasing them ad hoc in part. We don't know what isn't being released. And I think he would be doing a service to the country if instead of working through these journalists who are his own intermediaries, if he gave everybody in the press access to all of this. Why do you think he's not doing that?
So I believe that Musk is trying to create a more easy to understand story here, with some of these journalists who are trying to put it in context. And I certainly understand that inclination. When you really look at all of this information, you can see that it's voluminous, that it encompasses everything from internal emails and Slack discussions. There's a lot of references to jargon that most people outside of Twitter might not understand what it means. There's a lot of long strings of numbers which refer to prior tweets, which have to be put into the system to even understand what tweet people are talking about. So I get that, but I agree with you entirely that it would make more sense. Yeah, maybe put out the narrative and have them release it, but then also just release all of it and let people begin to go through it so that, first of all, you can't have some in the press, which they're what they're doing right now, saying that this is not reliable or verifiable and therefore we don't have to follow it up. This is partly what has allowed a lot of the mainstream media to just ignore this story. But also because if Twitter has shown us anything in the past, it's that you get these Twitter sleuthers and they begin to put pieces together. Having a sort of crowd sharing moment looking through all these documents would probably get the story out there even faster in the end.
The shadow banning that seems to have taken place, and one of those banned or whose message was suppressed is Jay Bhattacharya. He's the Stanford Medical School professor who is one of the signers of the Great Barrington Declaration. That's a declaration by prominent scientists that argued, I think, as early as the autumn of 2020, that rather than have these enormous lockdowns of the government, or of the economy, private economy, and all of these rules that were so costly because they shut down so much of American society, including schools, they argued for a policy of focused protection. Focus on those who are most vulnerable, the elderly, those with illnesses, pre-existing illnesses that would make COVID that much more threatening to them. Focus on protecting them, and then let children go to school, let everybody else, particularly young people who are much less at risk, get on with their lives. Now, we know in retrospect, Kim, that the lockdowns were enormously costly to public health, costly to mental health, costly to the economy, costly to the government. It would have been nice to actually have a debate over the Great Barrington Declaration and the alternative that it offered. We editorialized in favor of it at the time, said, let's have a debate. Now, it turns out we weren't allowed to have that debate because Twitter and Facebook and all these other places downplayed this point of view, so it didn't get out as much as it should have. And, of course, the mainstream media, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they ignored it. And we know from released emails between Francis Collins, who ran NIH at the time, National Institutes of Health, and Anthony Fauci, who was one of the leaders of COVID public health policy, they colluded together to try to squelch the Great Barrington Declaration and those alternative views just when it was needed most. This is, in many ways, to me, is the most destructive thing we've learned so far about the role that Twitter played in downplaying a crucial public debate in this country at enormous cost.
Yes, precisely because it's such a clear-cut example of a situation in which, as you say, we needed that debate, and yet one of the most powerful actors out there in terms of free speech was suppressing it. But I'd note, Paul, that a number of other examples came up as well of how Twitter suppresses visibility of tweets, or at least it did prior to Musk. And whether that was for political views, whether it's on climate, whether it was on election claims, anything that the progressive left within Twitter, and we do know that that workforce is largely leans one direction, if they didn't like it, they slapped a visibility warning on you and essentially had the ability to muffle your tweets or to bar the ability for people to search for them or to keep them out of their trending lists that they had. And the other really fascinating thing that came out of this, Paul, which I think really deserves a lot more scrutiny, is the process by which they would come up with a rationale to do that. And in particular, we now know that the key role that these, quote, fact-checking groups and trusted media now play. There's this amazing moment in the files that were released this weekend where Yoel Roth, who was the former head of trust and safety at Twitter, he sees a tweet come along that he doesn't particularly like, and he says, asks his team, he says, do we have a debunk moment on this yet? And what he means is there somebody out there, a fact checker or a news reporter like at Reuters who said, this is not really true, or we rate this false, because they would then go and grab that and use it as their justification to either lower the visibility of a tweet or to ban a tweet or take it down and to suspend an account. And I think that deserves a lot more attention as well, too, this role of these outside climate scientists and different fact-checking groups that claim to be the final word on things, when in fact they're expressing a viewpoint as well, and Twitter is using them, though, as justification to shut down debate.
Yeah, and some of our contributors on climate and COVID have been the subject of these so-called professional debunkers who are really just offering an alternative opinion, which they claim to be fact checkers. And fact checkers is just another word in this context for people who don't like your point of view and are going to hide behind this title of being fact checkers, but they're really just writing in a competing op-ed. But they're given pride of place by Twitter and Facebook, and therefore tend to be very destructive. And I would say one other point to make, and this is buttressing your point about the rest of the press coverage here. Yeah, they can use that excuse that these documents have not been completely released. They're being released piecemeal and may lack a certain larger context. But I don't think the press is doing itself a favor by downplaying it and ignoring it. They ought to at least address it. And they can do it skeptically, perhaps, but at least address it. And I think it's hurting the press with a huge portion of the public because they just see that this is being ignored, and their conclusion is it's being ignored for political reasons.